Olá, obrigado pela espera. Espero que tenha tido um bom almoço. Ou pequeno almoço. Não sei. Pronto, então de seguida vamos ter o Rafael Maia. Eu tinha uma breve apresentação para a palestra dele, que é Timbre e a criação de realidades auditivas. Rafael Maia é um artista sonoro e investigador do Porto cuja prática opera na interseção entre a arte sonora, as artes performativas e a ciência. Atualmente é bolseiro de doutoramento, financiado pela FCT, na Universidade Católica Portuguesa, e é professor convidado aqui na ESMAI. A sua investigação centra-se em novas estratégias para a criação e expressão tímbrica, trabalho que tem conduzido a inúmeras colaborações artístico-científicas e participações em conferências internacionais, nomeadamente no EXCOAX, em Dundee, no Reino Unido, e no IRCAM, em Paris, França, onde foi orador convidado para apresentar a sua investigação. Rafael possui um sólido percurso de apresentações e performances internacionais em países como Alemanha, Bélgica, França, Lituânia, Países Baixos... É para dizer tudo? Ok. Pronto, Reino Unido e Suécia. A sua carreira é também marcada por várias distinções, destacando o MAT Acquisition Award em 2021, o Digitopia Creation Award da Casa da Música em 2024 e o prémio semibreve Scholar Enigma no ano passado. Esta pela sua recente instalação sonora Sonic Interactions for Intangible Existences, Dark Matter. Portanto, dou-vos as boas-vindas ao Rafael Maia e obrigado.
Olá, obrigado Bernardo pela apresentação super lisonjeira. Espero que vocês não estejam com aquele sono pós-almoço, senão acho que vos vou adormecer pela certa. Ainda por cima vou fazer isto em inglês, por isso. Can I have o meu PowerPoint? So what I'm going to present today is part of my PhD research, which is dedicated to exploring new methods and strategies for timbral creation and expression. As some of you might know, I began my career, academic and artistic career here at ESMAI, where I studied light and sound for theater. And when we study sound for theater, we are always looking at sound as a language, an artistic language to convey a story, to create an environment, ultimately to create an alternative reality. And for me, the potential to create these alternative realities lies in the timbre of a sound. So, what exactly is timbre? The current and most common definition for timbre, as you might know, is that attribute of auditory sensation in terms of which a listener can judge that two sounds similarly presented and having the same loudness and pitch are dissimilar. Well, this is all very good, but this definition, the problem with this definition is that it doesn't help us a lot because it defines timbre more for what it is not than for what it actually is. Nevertheless, this phrase that dates back to the 60s resumes well the last decades of studies in which timbre has long been the subject of constant disagreement among those who study and work with it, never reaching a consensual definition. And this was the point that I started to understand the incredible mess that I was going into. However, mercifully, Zach Wallmark has compiled these decade-long discussions into two seemingly opposing cultures of timbre studies. On one side are the tangible studies, which see timbre as a physical property of sound, which can be measured through patterns in the acoustic signal. On the other side are the ineffable studies, which approach timbre as a purely subjective phenomena, accessible only through its psychological dimension. Between them, there seems to be an insurmountable methodological gap that has been called the timbral abyss. However, it is precisely in this tension that oscillates in between what happens physically and what is psychologically relevant that I see the greatest potential for timbral expression. As you know, timbre is what gives us the necessary clues to understand the sounds of our everyday environment. It is through timbre that we can objectively characterize and identify things like the space around us, the materials that produce the sound, the actions involved in it, and etc. On the other hand, it is also through these timbral cues that we connect emotionally to a sound and experience other very much subjective sensations, usually in listening modes like musical listening, in which the search for the source under specific conditions can be completely turned off and timbre is free to evoke emotions rather than objective sources. This means that timbre is not a fixed thing. It assumes different forms and functions depending on how the listener is connecting with the sound at the moment. Therefore, to really understand what timbre actually is, I needed to embrace this multidimensional complexity instead of trying to reduce it to either side of the timbral abyss. So I framed timbre in this research as a listening contingency. That means that in trying to interpret the acoustic cues of our surroundings, timbre will assume the form of the most probable solution to resolve the auditory environment and render a cohesive reality. To this process of converting sound into meaning, Cornelia calls perceptualization. Perceptualization is so efficient that we believe with absolute certainty that what we are hearing is the faithful translation of the acoustic world, when in reality it is just a projection of our listening minds. She says, we say, I hear a cricket, not I hear a sound that may indicate the presence of a cricket. We say, I hear a sad violin, when it is a sound we hear and we who are sad. Our entire world, it seems, is based on the substitution of the effect for the cause. With this observation, Cornelia has brought forward what she calls the paradox of timbre, where on one side, timbre can be very objective and efficient at describing and characterizing sonic events, but on the other hand, it is also the auditory percept that subjectively mostly diverges from listener to listener, such as when listening to music. And is at this paradox that things get interesting, because timbre, as a contingency, is capable of generating perceptual anomalies that deviate from the acoustic signal, creating instead alternative auditory realities to resolve ambiguity and attribute a functional meaning to sound. Cornelia has described two of these distinct timbral anomalies that occur under different modes of listening, the anomaly by extraction and the anomaly by redistribution. So simply putting it, the anomaly by extraction occurs when our mind reconstructs a possible sound source from hearing only the acoustic fragments extracted from the original sound, creating the perception of hearing something that is not present in the acoustic dimension. By redistribution, on the other hand, occurs when our mind fuses together several acoustic characteristics from multiple sound sources present in the same auditory scene, and almost like a chimera, creates a new imaginary sound source. This is where I find timbre's biggest potential as an artistic expression. As a sound artist or timbre creator, I can leverage these anomalies that emerge in each listener as a way to build alternative auditory realities for each individual in the audience. So this resonates directly with Salome Voglin, which in her book titled Sonic Possible Worlds invites us to question how each of us relates to the acoustic world, not merely by perceiving it, but by actively completing it, bringing to each sonic event a meaning that is deeply entangled with personal experience, memory, and imagination. Listening, in this sense, becomes an act of world-making, in which the listener participates in the construction of what is heard. Therefore, to explore these individual sonic possible worlds, I developed three creation methods through several exploratory sound installations. These are two of them that I chose to present to you today. And the first installation was developed in collaboration with Casa da Música and theoretical physicist Dr. Orfeo Bertolami. It all started as I approached Dr. Bertolami to explore the physical dimension of timbre. During our explorations, we ended up framing timbre as the state of matter and how we interpret it. This allowed us to articulate both the tangible and the ineffable sides of the timbral abyss, treating it as something that reveals the state of matter through our interpretation. This is a line of thought that very much aligns with Rosa Menkman's work, who, together with scientists of CERN, rethinks the invisible dimensions of the universe through art. So following this line, in this installation, timbral expression became a strategy for rethinking one of the most intangible matters of our universe, the dark matter. For those who don't know, dark matter is one of the biggest mysteries of physics to date and one of the most important substances in our universe. It is thought to hold our physical reality as we know it, composing the majority of the universe. However, it is dark because it does not interact with electromagnetic waves. So it does not reflect, absorbs, nor emit light, making it invisible, unmeasurable, and therefore undetectable. And now you might be thinking, if it's undetectable, then there is no way we can hear it. Well, yes, but that's where these anomalies, that's where we can leverage these anomalies. So in this installation, we created the conditions for the timbral anomaly by extraction to emerge as a contingent response to a situation of auditory ambiguity. And this is how we did it. The anomaly by extraction works by extracting partials or specific acoustic cues or behaviors from an original sound source and presenting these extracted fragments to a listener. The listener, in order to resolve these incomplete fragments, will start to reconstruct possible solutions for the source of the sound, eventually generating several mental representations that complete and give sense to the sound. So, assuming a theory that frames dark matter as a gas, we used the ideal gas equation of state to describe the state of dark matter and make sound behave as if it went through dark matter. The idea was to fill in the variables on the equation and use some intelligent convolution model to generate audible results. However, we forgot that dark matter is unmeasurable, so there is no quantitative data. Therefore, our only chance was to speculate on its qualitative description. And here, no artificial intelligence model would do us any good. We had to use real intelligence. So we set out on listing and describing the undulatory phenomena that would happen if the sound of a voice crossed from our matter, the baryonic matter, to a gas like dark matter, which would be much less dense and with very low particle interaction. These speculations were then designed and programmed in digital tools like Ableton Live and Max, where using a creative process very similar to what Alvin Lucier did in his piece I'm Sitting in a Room, I recorded a voice. A recorded voice was used to activate and excite these undulatory phenomena, which were then iterated over and over until what was left was just the extracted timbral behavior of this voice in a space like dark matter. The strategy used in the presentation of these results was instrumental for the anomaly by extraction to emerge. And a system like this, the soundscape system, would have come in very handy at the time. Much like our speculative process, we separated the West Foyer of Casa da Música into two distinct acoustic spaces, or states of matter. The space A represented dark matter and covered all the space surrounding the sculpture, which you can see in the first picture. This was a space where we diffused those extracted results. The space B represented normal matter, and this was a carefully designed and very narrow point of acoustic convergence that aligned with the red dot inside the sculpture, as you can see in the other photo. We designed the experience so that when people enter the room, the space A, all they hear all around are those extracted timbral fragments of the original sound, without having any reference that the original sound is a voice. This initiates the anomaly by extraction, where listeners mentally start to reconstruct possible solutions to make sense of these fragments, generating several sonic possible worlds, and this way, unknowingly creating a connection with this state of matter. The space B, on the other hand, was a space of acoustic convergence where the fragmented sounds in the room fused together with the original voice that was coming from an ultra-directional speaker, the red dot you see in the picture. When the listener finds this narrow acoustic point in space, all these sonic possible worlds collapse because the original source, the voice, is revealed by perfectly fusing with the fragments happening all around you. But maybe that's enough of talking for now. I was very fortunate to have the incredible film director Francisco Dias film its own perspective of the piece, and I will share it with you. A series of phenomena, or just phenomena, without any tangible result. So I had the pleasure of collaborating with Elder Maia in the making of the sculpture, Ana Lídia in the text, Bernardo Bento in sound editing, Oscar Rodrigues and Digitopia in the overall development, and of course Dr. Bertolami in the theoretical physics. Sorry. These are just some photos of a re-exhibition of the piece at Semi-Breve. And these are some of the conclusions. I will focus just in the second there. It was shown that in space A, where the extracted results were diffused, listeners with no prior knowledge of the original sound source or the concept reported hearing very dissimilar acoustic sources and timbral percepts among them, while listeners that were previously aware of the concept of the piece consistently reported hearing a manipulated or transformed voice even before reaching the space B. And this means that a contextual framing of the experience might actually change the way you hear and solve auditory ambiguity, thus raising another question. Can timbral perception be shaped by contextual interference in a situation of auditory ambiguity? And so to answer this question, Casa da Música challenged me to create a new piece to integrate Portugal's Freedom Day celebrations. In this installation, we explored the strategy in which timbre would be liberated. That is, in its final realization, escapes the control of the composer to emerge instead as a mental representation that is unique to each listener. Here, the composer only writes the contextual framing, and it is the listener that builds its own auditory world. Whereas in the first installation, the extracted signal carried acoustic cues that guided the listener into specific timbral realizations, in this installation, the acoustic signal becomes almost irrelevant to the timbral perceptual outcome, which is guided solely through a contextual interference. And so to trigger this form of timbre, mental timbre, as McAdams calls it, I drew on Cornelius' second anomaly, the anomaly by redistribution. This redistribution anomaly differs from the first in that it occurs when a listener is exposed to something like a noise. That is, when the listener has to deal with an auditory situation that is full of concurrent acoustic cues, like an overload of acoustic information. In trying to make sense of this overwhelming situation, our mind begins to redistribute and reorganize these cues into coherent sources, eventually fusing together acoustic cues that belong to different sound sources, like a chimera, thus creating a virtual sound that is not present in the acoustic signal. So, according to Cornelia, however, these anomalies do not arise from an ambiguous acoustic signal alone, but from a disruption in the perceptual processes that normally groups acoustic cues into coherent auditory objects, or as we call it, gestalts. Auditory gestalts are perceptual sound objects that emerge from the self-organization of multiple acoustic features to form a cohesive and understandable auditory scene. For example, when you are in the street, sound waves from everything that is happening around you arrive at your ear simultaneously. Then the brain does this extraordinary task of organizing all the spectral and temporal information into distinct sound objects, or gestalts, which can be understood separately as the people talking, the bus passing by, the cars, etc. The auditory scene analysis tells us that for the mind to create and maintain these gestalts, the acoustic cues must follow some principles. Some of them are known as proximity, similarity, good continuation, common fate, closure, and predictability. I won't bother you with an explanation of each of them. At this point, it is enough to say that in order to create a situation of auditory ambiguity that leads to the redistribution anomaly, I had to undermine all of these principles. And I'm now realizing that essentially I had to destroy all the psychoacoustic processes that actually make this soundscape thing work. Because by deliberately doing this, we are creating a moment in time where gestalt formation and meaning are suspended. And at this moment, a sound can become anything. And one effective way to undermine those principles is through the use of dense sound clusters resembling noise, in which multiple sound sources, each containing numerous spectral and temporal cues, coexist and compete. In these conditions, no single source is able to dominate the perceptual field, and usual mechanisms of auditory grouping are placed under strain. To create these clusters, I have aligned with a lineage of compositional practices that go from Ligeti's micropolyphony and Shennaki's stochastic clouds, which approach sound clusters not as collection of discrete events, but as moving reservoirs of perceptual possibilities. However, contrary to Ligeti or Shennaki's, I chose to work with ready-made clusters. That is, I set out to record the sea as my main source. And I did it for two main reasons. The first is that the sea retains within its spectromorphological complexity some sort of memory, history, and culture, behaving as sonic clouds that embody chaos while moving in ways that are somehow familiar, a characteristic that became essential in creating auditory ambiguity. The second is related to the contextual framing. While people celebrate Portugal's Freedom Day, it becomes important to reflect on our responsibilities towards the sea as an historically important space of possibilities for Portuguese people, but also as a space of responsibility. The responsibility to hear in its noise not just the joyful laughter of victories, but also every plea, every cry for help of the people that turn to the sea in hope of salvation. So, by cultivating such conditions of auditory ambiguity, perceptual grouping becomes now destabilized, allowing acoustic components in the clusters to detach and become available for perceptual reorganization. At this stage, a contextual interference plays a crucial role, guiding listeners to actively search for plausible sound sources within the noise. And this is where Speak enters the process. Speak is a project that was developed at IRCAM that aimed to collect the lexicon that directly correlates to specific timbral sensations, enabling a more precise description of auditory perception. To create the contextual interference, Lydia and I drew directly from Speak's lexicon to create two narratives for a single noise, each with opposing dramaturgies and timbral sensations. This approach allowed us to understand if the audience could actually be guided into hearing different things in the same noise. Because the piece works in the domain of metaphysical, I chose to display the narratives using two holograms projected inside two large test tubes, using the Pepper's Ghost technique. On the left, you can see narrative A, which was visible only in the upper part of the room, while narrative B, on the right, appeared only in the lower part of the room. People could only see one narrative at a time from each side. The narratives did not reveal the sea until the very end. This video shows the end of the loop where it is finally revealed. I'm sorry for the quality of these videos, but unfortunately the professional ones were inexplicably lost. Although I wanted to treat these clusters as a continuum, like an uninterrupted soundscape, it became apparent in the first rehearsals that people entered the state of auditory habituation by the end of more or less 4 minutes, perceptually erasing the noise. So I had to incorporate some bursts or sonic slaps, as I like to call them, to wake the audience's active listening mode. Okay. So to conclude, in post-experience conversations, the audience groups from narrative A and B reported hearing markedly distinct timbral perceptions as sound sources and sound sources between them, suggesting that the proposed strategy effectively generated redistribution anomalies through the articulation of auditory ambiguity and contextual interference, holding strong potential as a perceptual composition method. It was also shown that trained ears were not easily influenced by the contextual interference, resisting the imposed narratives and focusing instead in acutely exploring the minute timbral variations that were embedded in the clusters. This reveals that a trained ear is not as vulnerable to be manipulated by imposed narratives, being able to engage critically with the noise and avoid auditory anomalies. And for a conclusion, I hope this may also serve as a reminder to keep training your ears and remain a resistance to imposed narratives. Thank you.